Hey, thank you so much for joining us this weekend. It would not be the same without you. We're thrilled to have you from wherever you're joining us. We are here in Detroit, and I'm joined by a lot of great people, some of my best friends here in this room from the Cross and Anchor team, and we just want to welcome you. Can we welcome those who are joining us today, watching? Come on. I said it and I meant it. It would not be the same without you, whether you're watching in a home, with other people, which that's the season that we're in as a church, getting together in homes every weekend all across Detroit and even beyond. We had our first home gathering in Canada last weekend. Shout out to Yvette for having friends over. I saw the pictures. It looked great. So cool. I'm just so excited to see what God continues to do as we gather in homes and kind of kick it back old school style, like the book of Acts, getting together, breaking bread in homes, and seeing God use that to reach our city, our community, and even our world. Well, I've got a message for you today that I'm excited to share. I've called it, Where Do We Go From Here? Where do we go from here? I grew up in a mobile home. I don't know if you're familiar with mobile homes, but they are on wheels, and they're called mobile homes because you can literally move them from one place to another. And so we grew up in a mobile home, and I remember one day my brother was learning how to drive. He'd probably hate it if I shared this story. And the way that mobile homes work is that there's this siding underneath them so you can't see that they're kind of like stood up on stilts, and he crashed into the side of the house. I thought it was an earthquake in Kansas. It's not a very common occurrence, but I was waking up and the house was shaking, and he had gone underneath the mobile home. And mobile homes are something I'm used to. But we live in a state constantly of transition. We're going from one place to another. We're in a place of going different areas in our life, different states, different things that we're learning, that we're growing, and we're in a state of transition. I don't know about you, but I hate camping. I'm sorry if you love camping. I know I just broke your heart when I said that, but I cannot stand camping. I remember this guy. He's a comedian, and he said that, why would I go and spend 50 weeks out of the year to go and spend 2 weeks and pretend like I'm homeless? Like that's how I feel about camping. It's like, let's take everything that's already available to us inside and is easy to use, and let's bring it outside and make it way more uncomfortable and 10 times harder to do. That's a great time together as a family. I've never really gotten it. Maybe you love it. You're like, I love the smell of smoke. And I remember when my dad used to take me camping, and I love smelling like a campfire, and I love not being able to sleep because it's so cold, and I love that the floor is so hard, and I don't even want to have a bed, and I just like seeing the stars at night and waking up at 5 a.m. when the sun's up, because when the sun's up, you're up. Hey, that's great. I actually prefer living in a house, and I'm cool with that. But we're constantly in a state of transition. We're going to look at a story today in the Old Testament. And there's a group of people who are in a state of transition. You could say in one way that they were kind of in like a mobile home. They were moving from one place to another, and they were kind of on this unending camp out journey where they didn't yet have a permanent home. Exodus chapter 13 is where we're at today. In case you don't know the story of Exodus, I'll just catch you up quickly to what's happening here. There was this guy named Israel. His other name was Jacob. He had some kids, 12 kids. One of them, his name was Joseph. And Joseph got sold into slavery when he was just a kid. His brothers hated him because he kind of thought that he was better than everyone else, or maybe just that God had bigger plans for him than everyone else. And then he made the mistake of telling his brothers what he thought God's plans were for his life and how it involved them bowing down to him. And that doesn't really go over well with your older brothers, or really with anybody for that matter. And so they took a very extreme action. They threw him into a pit and they sold him into slavery. Probably something you wish you could have done to your little brothers and sisters a bunch growing up. Well, they actually did it. And Joseph was then taken to this place called Egypt. And in Egypt, he was working for one of the most high royal up regal people in all of Egypt. And he became a very trusted servant in this man's house. But then he got framed for a crime that he didn't commit, and he got thrown into prison. And then when he was in prison, he spent years and years and years in prison. And while he was there, he was elevated, and they trusted him so much that they basically were letting him run the prison, even though he was a prisoner himself. And then eventually, there were these two guys in prison with him who had worked for the king. Now, you're like, okay, wow, this is a whole long story. Well, just hang on. So these two guys, they worked for the king, and they were both in prison, and they had a dream. Joseph noticed that they had this look of like despair on their face or despondency, and so he went over to him. He's like, what's wrong? And they said, well, I had this dream, and they needed an interpreter. He interpreted the dream for him. It ended up meaning that one of the guys was going to be restored back to being a servant of the king, and the other guy was going to get killed. So the guy who continued to live said, I'm going to remember you, Joseph, when I get out of here. And so later, much down the road, the Pharaoh himself has a dream, and he can't understand it. But he knows that it's significant. He knows that it means something. And so he's like, who can interpret this dream? And he calls all these magicians and all these people who he thought would have the ability to unlock the mystery of his dream, and no one could figure it out. And then the guy who had forgotten about Joseph, who still worked for the king, said, hold on, I know a guy. And how many of you know that in a moment, years and years of you feeling like you're forgotten can be erased. And God can take you from the prison and he can put you in the palace. God can take you from the pit and he can put you into the place where he's called you to be. Yeah. Every season is not a wasted season. It's a season of preparation for what God has for you in the future. And so God was working on Joseph's character this whole time, was faithful to him throughout all of it. And then in a moment, he's in front of Pharaoh, who was like the biggest deal on earth at the time. The guy who basically ruled the world. And Joseph has an audience with Pharaoh, and he gives him the interpretation to his dream, which was that there was going to be years of plenty, and then there was going to be years of famine, and that Pharaoh and the kingdom of Egypt needed to prepare for it. And then Pharaoh's like, well, who am I going to get to run this? How about the guy who had the wisdom to interpret this dream? And so now the man who was in prison, now the man who was a servant to this guy who worked for the government, now this man was running the government. And everybody in Egypt was subject to him except for Pharaoh himself. And so then there is the famine that Joseph prophesied, or that he interpreted the dream of. And because of the famine, people from all over were going to Egypt to get grain because they were wise enough to store it up for the future. And so Joseph's brothers, who lived in a different place, had to go to Egypt to get grain. And they didn't remember that they did not remember, actually they didn't even know that their brother was alive. The last they had heard of him was when they sold him into slavery, and they had lived with years and years and years of regret over this decision, and even covering it up by lying to their father that their brother had been murdered by wild animals. And so now they're in Egypt, and Joseph's there, and he sees them walk in, and he recognizes them. And he starts to give them this series of tests. And there's times when he has to pull himself away because all of the emotion of this is flooding over him. And now the dreams that he had when he was a kid came true. The things that God had told him when he was a young man were now coming to fruition. And his brothers are in front of him, bowing down to him because he's basically the prince of Egypt. Well, fast forward, because of the famine and all the things, all of Joseph's brothers and his whole family ends up moving to Egypt. They go to Egypt and they settle down there, and they get this whole part of the land that was reserved for shepherds, and they get treated like royalty because they're related to Joseph. And all of Israel now is living in Egypt. 400 years later, and that's right, 400 years later. There was a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, who didn't remember the stories of what had happened in the past, and he started to treat the Israelites like slaves. And he started to put on them hard, brutal labor. And he started to treat them in an unjust way. And so the children of Israel, they cried out to their God, and they said, God, would you send us a deliverer? And so God sends them this man, Moses. And Moses goes to Pharaoh, and you know the story. He says, Pharaoh, let my people go. You can type it in the chat. You can say it at your homes to each other. Let my people
go.
And 10 plagues later, because Pharaoh's heart was so hard that it took 10 plagues before he would relent and let the children of Israel leave. 10 plagues later, they find themselves leaving the land of bondage, the land of slavery, and on their way to the promised land. That's where we pick up our story today. Exodus chapter 13. I hope you're okay with that whole long lesson, Bible story of where we find ourselves. Exodus chapter 13, I want to read verse 17. It says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. For Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here." That was 400 years before this. "And they moved on from Succoth and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart before the people." So now here's the children of Israel. They're leaving Egypt. They're embarking onto this journey to occupy this land that God had promised their descendants hundreds of years before. And they don't get to take the shortcut, but they take the scenic route. I don't know about you, but I hate wasting any time when I'm driving. I want to find the shortest distance from point A to point B. And then sometimes your maps gives you the options, like, well, do you want to take a longer route? I'm like, why? Who says yes? Yeah, take me along the longer route. I always want to find the shortest route from point A to point B. And sometimes we feel like that in our walk with God. We want God to take us to where he wants us to be the quickest way possible. We don't want to go through the difficulty. We don't want to go through the challenge. We don't want to go through the pain. And so we say, God, take me from point A to point B along the fastest routes. Siri, take me there the quickest way possible. But God says, sometimes I'm going to take you along the scenic route. Because listen, God knows that in order for you to walk into the promised land, that you've got to be prepared for the promised land.
That's right.
And so the children of Israel, they were led the long way because God knew at this point, if he were to take them the fastest way, that they were going to go along a way where they saw things that were going to make them afraid and that were going to keep them from walking into what God had for them. He knew their hearts were too tender at this point to take them through something. Are you sometimes frustrated with God and upset because he seems to be taking you the long way around? But would you know that maybe the quicker way would actually be worse? If God were to take you the quicker way, maybe you think, oh, I'd get there faster. No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't get there at all.
Wow.
Because God knows what you need. And so that's why this verse says at the beginning, in verse 17, I'm not going to take them that way, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. I don't want these people thinking, I got to go back to Egypt, the place that they had cried out to be delivered from. He doesn't want them thinking, maybe it was not so bad back there. He wants them to walk into the promised land. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And I love this in verse 19, that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear that they would do it. How awesome is Joseph? Here's this guy living in Egypt, hundreds of years away from what God was going to do when he gave the children of Israel a whole land to inhabit. And listen, at this time, I mean, there's, 100 or 150 with all of the kids and all the grandkids and all this stuff. There's that many people who are considered Israelites. Did you know that by the time this happened, there were 1 million Israelites?
Wow.
1 million. And so God didn't take them to the promised land because they weren't ready for the promised land yet. They didn't need the promised land yet. By now, they're actually becoming a people. a nation who needs a land and a space. And so Joseph, 400 years previously, he was so confident. He was so confident that God was going to do what he said, that he's like, listen, you need to understand this. When I die, I want you to hang on to my bones, and I want you to take them with you to the land that God's promised us. Listen, do you have like enough confidence in God today to say, listen, God is going to do what he said. God is going to take us where he said he was going to take us. God is going to do what he said he's going to do. So much so that I'm going to put it on my wall, that I'm going to make you tell me and promise me that you're going to take me there when you get there. Because when God says something, it's a surety, it's not a maybe.
That's right.
It's a promise. It's not something that you have to hope for and think maybe it will happen. It's guaranteed. So then they are guided by God as a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. And this would be how God continued to lead them for 40 years as they journeyed from Egypt to the Promised Land. Now, we don't have time to get into all the stuff. It wasn't supposed to take 40 years, by the way. It was supposed to take a very short period of time. But they didn't believe God. And so as a result, they ended up wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. Listen, you don't have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. You can believe God and obey him. And that's going to be much better than wandering for 40 years. But anyway, it did take them 40 years. And all that time, God led them from one place to another as a pillar of cloud and a fire. A pillar of cloud and a fire. Going from one place to the next in their little mobile homes, their little camping units, setting up the place where God inhabited, which was called the tabernacle, and tearing it down, setting it back up, tearing it down again, following the pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night. They didn't know where they were going. They just had to follow God because God's the only one who knew the way. There wasn't a GPS. There wasn't a map. There wasn't an atlas. Did anybody grow up like with those big maps in the back of their car? And then when you go into a new city, your parents would make you pull it out and you have to try to like figure out how to get to where you're going. I don't even know how we lived 20 years ago. How did we do this? How did we do this? Where directions are stored in my brain now is the same place where phone numbers are stored, which is, I don't know, because my computer and my phone knows for me. So I just follow that. So they didn't have that. So they had to follow a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. God does tell us oftentimes where we're going to end up, but he doesn't tell us the path it's going to take to get there. And what we need to do is just follow him every step of the way. And sometimes it's not going to look like we thought. Sometimes it's going to take longer than we thought. Sometimes it's going to go a different direction than we would have picked. But as long as we follow him, we have the guarantee that his presence is with us. And wherever his presence is, he is. And wherever he is, he's going to get us to where we're going. So we just follow him, pillar of cloud and fire. I think there's so many different applications for this in our lives. Like you could find a bunch of different ways that this applies to. Maybe even God's speaking to you today already about the ways that this story is applying to your life. But I do think about the season that we are in as a church. Maybe you've been following along the journey with us. We're only a year and a half old. We're just a baby church. We launched in March of 2019 in the building that I'm standing in, not in this room, but in another room downstairs. And we saw God, like I felt like he parted the Red Sea for us. Yeah. Like we opened the doors and it was so packed that we could not fit everyone into the room. People were like literally up at the top, like it was like Zacchaeus climbing a tree, like so they could see Jesus, except I'm not Jesus, I'm not nearly as cool. It was disappointing when they got up there, but like they were like, people were just, it was jam-packed, there was a line, like everyone's mind was blown, myself included, because God did the miraculous. And that's what happened with Israel is God led them miraculously out of Egypt. And they were like, my goodness, God's done something incredible. And then they were on this journey with God from point A to point B. And for us, the next stop in our journey was this old Catholic cathedral that we met in for about a year and a half here in Detroit. It's a beautiful building. And very abruptly, very suddenly, very unexpectedly, somebody else started renting the cathedral, and we were, in a sense, homeless. And we didn't have much time to prepare, and we had to figure out what was next. And we already have online services, and so we were like, well, what if we just kind of married the technology of what we have, like the new, fresh way of doing church, with like old school, like getting together in people's homes and hanging out and like eating meals and sharing life. And what if that was a recipe for success? And what if instead of being limited to just one location in Detroit, we're actually able to go to 10, 15, 20 locations because our church is opening up their homes and inviting people over? And what if we just followed this cloud that was leading us from one place to the next? I don't know the ultimate journey. I don't know how it's all going to turn out. All I know is that God has now led us to this new season. He's led us from a cathedral into people's homes. And listen, we're not homeless because now your home is our home. I hope you're cool with me sleeping on your couch and opening your refrigerator because I'm living with you now. We're all with you because this is the new season that we're in as a church. A cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. What that meant is that the children of Israel could move at any time. They could go during the day and they could go at night because they had light in the evening and they had a cloud during the day. The cloud served also, as well as the fire, as protection for them.
That's good.
Wherever they were at, that the cloud was, it kept enemies away from them as well as the pillar of fire. And so they could not be more safe than when they were following God and his presence was with them. Listen, you might be scared today. You might be scared because of COVID-19. You might be scared because of something going on in your life. You might be scared. Listen, God's presence is your protection. And where God is, he will keep you. And he will make sure that nothing ultimately does harm to you that he hasn't allowed for your good and for his glory. God, being with him is the safest place you can be. Cloud by day and a fire by night. And listen, this happened, like I said, for 40 years. Listen, this happened in the middle of their disobedience. Even though they fumbled the ball at the 1 yard line and decided they couldn't get into the promised land, God still said, I'm going to guide you. Pillar of fire by night and cloud by day for 40 years. God is more committed to you than you are to him. And I think that needs to encourage us today. Because I don't know about you, I'm not all that good at following God sometimes. I don't know about you, but I make mistakes every single day. I don't do the things I want to do sometimes, and I do the things that I don't want to do oftentimes, and still I look back and I see that there's a pillar of cloud, a pillar of fire and a cloud by day. God isn't going to leave you because you made some mistakes. God is going to stay by your side, and he's going to get you to where you need to be. You just got to follow him to where he leads you next. There was protection, there was grace. He was their way, and he was their light. And they just had to follow from one place to the next. Listen, I want to encourage you today because God, in his infinite wisdom, knows what we need. And he also doesn't want us to get so caught up in the old thing that we miss the new thing. In the book of Ezra, they went from a tabernacle to a temple, so this portable church that they set up and tore down, to a permanent facility where God's presence was dwelling. Then the temple got destroyed. Then they rebuilt it. And in Ezra 3:12, it tells us that the older generation, as they saw the foundation for the temple being laid, they cried. And the younger generation, they shouted for joy. So that you couldn't tell the difference between the crying and the shouts for joy. Because the older generation remembered the former temple, the way that it used to be, the way that they liked it. And the younger generation was just glad that there was something new starting, a fresh work of God, that God's presence was going to dwell there again, that through that temple there was going to be people who encountered God, people whose lives changed, people who were healed from diseases, people who were never going to be the same because of the presence of God dwelling among them. They were excited about the new thing that God was doing. And I wonder today if you can let go of the old thing and walk into the new thing. Because just like the children of Israel were being led by this pillar of fire and there was a tabernacle where God's presence was, listen, we are where God's presence is. Mm-hmm. The Bible calls us the temple of the Holy Spirit. And I don't know about you, but I want to spend my life building God's house. I want to spend my life doing something that counts, that matters for eternity. Yeah. And listen, if it was worth Jesus' blood to buy it, it's worth your life to build it.
Come on, that's so good.
I want a church that's like, yeah, this is uncomfortable. This is a new season. I don't even know exactly how this works. I'm just supposed to like watch this thing online and invite people over to my house. And like, that's considered church. And like, I need to go to a building. I need it to be a place. I need to go to the No, you don't. God is where you are.
Yeah.
And wherever you go, there God is.
Come on.
And so you don't need a building. You don't need a facility. You don't need a steeple. You don't need a cathedral. You don't need a parking lot. You don't even need a kids ministry. You just need an open door.
Come on. That's great.
And so I want to encourage us today. I think some of us, we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. That's such a weird way of saying things. Who does that? Who would even do that? How would you not be able to tell? There was a baby in that bathwater. Like, how dirty does that water have to be before there is no understanding that there's a baby in the bathwater? And who is throwing out their bathwater? Why don't you just drain the tub? And the baby's not going to fall into the drain. Anyway, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Listen, it's new, it's different. Maybe it's not comfortable. Maybe you're like, I don't understand how Listen, God's doing a new thing. And wherever we gather is where God is. And so I want to encourage you to come along this journey with us. It would be so tempting to be like, I'm just going to find this other thing. I just want to encourage you, don't shortchange yourself on what God might want to do in your life this season. Don't give up because you're like, I just want the thing that I'm used to. Be willing to embrace the new thing and watch God do something incredible both in and through you. It really depends on you. Are you going to embrace this? Are you going to say, I'm still committed to this? Are you going to say, I'm going to be a part of this, not just watch it, I'm going to actually be a part of this? Because I believe if you do, that there is something so incredible that we're going to get all witness together. Yeah. Let's continue to be generous during this time, because our church, it's not like our church stops. I mean, we've still got bills to pay. We've still got people to reach. We've still got people to help. Like, we can't give up on being faithful right now. We got to continue to invest and to work and to just be sacrificial and to serve. Because listen, I'm just going to be honest, okay? Detroit needs our church. Detroit needs our church. I'm not saying that because we're so awesome or because we're the best thing ever. Detroit needs the church. Yeah. And it needs every church that's here. But there's a unique calling that God's placed on us that Detroit would not be the same without, and we need to rise up and be a part of that. Maybe you just found this because a friend shared it on Facebook, or maybe you just stumbled upon this through your feed, seeing all this stuff like, oh, I hate Trump, I hate Biden, blah, blah, blah. And then you saw this thing and you're like, I'll watch this because it's not negative. Well, thank you. We're so glad that you're here. And the truth is it's not negative because God has good news for you.
That's good, yeah.
God has a good plan for you. Yes. God has something that the news media outlets aren't going to put on their front page every day, because God has something that is so incredible that they wouldn't even make money if they were to put it on, because it's always this negative news that sells. God loves you. God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die for you. And because he loves you so much, he stopped at nothing so that he could have a relationship with you. And he even sent this message into your home today so that you could know that God hasn't forgotten about you, that there's not a purposelessness to your existence, but there's a purpose, and that there's a hope, and that there's a future for you. And all you have to do to walk into that is just accept Jesus by faith. You don't have to do anything to earn it. You don't have to be good enough. You don't have to go to church. All you have to do is just say, God, I want you in my life. I turn away from this kind of life that I had before, and I start following you. And he'll come into your life, he'll change you, and he'll give you a fresh start. And we just want to invite you into that today. And then we want to be a home for you so that you can have a place to follow God with other people. And if you're watching and you want to respond to that and say, this is the day that I'm going to see my life change, that I'm going to walk with Jesus, that I'm going to turn away from my sin, and I'm going to turn to him, then what I want you to do is just pray this prayer with me, okay? Just say this to God. You can say it out loud or just in your heart to him. Say, dear God, I give my life to you. I ask for your forgiveness. I ask you to give me a new start. Come into me and change me. From this day forward, I'm yours. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. We're all celebrating with you here in this room. If you're in a home, then tell somebody that you prayed that prayer. Somebody is going to be so excited about that. We'll get you a Bible. If you're watching online, maybe you're not with other people, would you just write yes in the chat wherever you're at? Just type yes. You can also email us if you're more comfortable with that. Just email info@crossandanchorchurch.com. We're going to digitally high-five you. We've got a Bible for you, and we just want to give you some resources to help you in this new journey with God. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back next weekend. Love you. Love you guys.